The conference hall floated in the darkness between stars, a massive structure of glass and steel that had witnessed 500 years of peace. Horizon's Gate Station was neutral ground, built by both humans and Zarlans after the war that nearly destroyed them both. Inside the Grand Chamber, representatives from across the galaxy gathered for what should have been a simple ceremony. General Hannah stood near the viewing window, watching distant stars shimmer against the void. She wore her dress uniform, dark blue with silver stars marking her rank. At 63, her hair had gone completely white, but her posture remained straight as steel. She had spent 40 years of her life making sure the treaty held. 40 years of negotiations, compromises, and careful words that prevented bloodshed. The Zarlan delegation entered through the far doors. They moved in perfect coordination, their chitinous bodies gleaming under the station lights. The Zarlans looked like a fusion of mantis and beetle, standing on powerful hind legs with 4 manipulating arms. Their compound eyes reflected light in strange patterns, and they communicated through both sound and chemical signals that made the air around them smell like copper and ozone. Crown Mind Velshera led them, the supreme consciousness that guided the Zarlan Empire. The Crown Mind was actually 17 individual Zarlans linked through neural symbiosis, moving and thinking as one entity. When they spoke, all 17 voices harmonized into a single sound that resonated through the chamber. Hannah had negotiated with the previous Crown Mind dozens of times. That one had been cautious, respectful of what humans could do if pushed too far. But Velshera was young by Zarlan standards, barely a century old, and had known nothing but peace. The old Crown Mind had fought in the last war. This one only knew stories. The ceremony began with the traditional exchange. Ambassador Deho, representing Earth and her colonies, read the treaty articles. His voice was soft but clear, carrying easily through the acoustically perfect hall. Deho was a small man with gentle eyes who believed absolutely in the power of words to solve problems. He had never seen war. He had never needed to. When it came time for the Zarlan response, something went wrong. Instead of the Crown Mind, a younger Zarlan stepped forward. Prince Kasrim was smaller than the others, his carapace still showing the bronze coloring of youth. He clicked his mandibles in what humans had learned was contempt. "We renew this treaty," Kasrim said, his voice sharp and buzzing. "Though we question its continued necessity. The humans have grown soft. 500 years of peace have made them forget what they were. They are tamed predators now, kept docile by their own prosperity." The chamber went silent. Even the other Zarlans seemed surprised by the prince's words. Hannah felt every eye turned toward her, waiting for her response. She had diffused worse situations than this. Insults were just words, and words could be managed. She stepped forward calmly. "Prince Kasrim," she said, her voice level and clear. "We remember exactly what we were. That is why we choose what we are now. The treaty stands because both our peoples decided that peace serves us better than war. Strength is not measured only in violence." Kasrim's antennae twitched with agitation. "You speak of strength while hiding behind words. The galaxy whispers that humanity has lost its edge. You build gardens now instead of warships. You write poetry while your fleet rusts in orbital graveyards." Hannah smiled, though her eyes remained cold. "Our ships are well maintained, Prince. We simply prefer not to use them. As for gardens, there is great strength in creation. Any fool can destroy. It takes wisdom to build." The other Zarlans were clicking among themselves now, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. Ambassador Deho tried to intervene, suggesting they move to the formal signing, but Kasrim was not finished. "I challenge this pretense," the prince said, his voice rising. "I challenge the very foundation of this treaty. It was signed by warriors on both sides, beings who understood the cost of war. Now we renew it with diplomats. With gardeners and poets. Where is the honor in this? Hannah's expression never changed, but those who knew her well could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was choosing her next words very carefully. Honor is not found in seeking war, Prince. It is found in preventing it. Every day this treaty holds, billions of lives continue in peace. That is worth more than any military glory. She turned then, her duty done. The insults had been weathered, the situation diffused. Tomorrow she would file a formal complaint through proper channels, and the Crown Mind would discipline the young prince for his breach of protocol. The treaty would be renewed as it had been renewed 50 times before. Peace would continue. But, as she turned, Kasrim moved. It happened so fast that even the Zarlan guards were caught by surprise. The prince drew an honor blade from his ceremonial harness, the weapon crackling with plasma energy. Zarlan law said such weapons could only be drawn when honor demanded blood. The plasma charge hit Hannah in the back, burning through her uniform and deep into her chest. She stumbled forward, her legs failing. Ambassador Deho caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her gently as chaos erupted around them. Human security forces rushed forward, weapons drawn. Zarlan guards moved to intercept, though whether to protect Kasrim or apprehend him was unclear. The Crown Mind's 17 voices rose in discordant shock, the neural link clearly struggling to process what had just happened. Hannah's breathing was shallow and rapid. The medical team would not arrive in time, everyone in the room knew it. Deho held her hand, tears streaming down his face, as the woman who had kept the peace for 40 years felt her life slipping away. She looked up at the ceiling, at the stars visible through the transparent dome above them. Her lips moved, and the room fell silent as everyone strained to hear her final words. The station's communication system picked them up, broadcasting them across both empires in real time. Remember, she whispered, blood flecking her lips. Remember what we were, before the peace. Then, General Hannah, the Iron Mediator, the woman who had prevented 100 wars, died in the same hall where she had preserved peace for half her lifetime. The galaxy held its breath. Every human watching the broadcast felt something ancient stir in their collective memory. Every Zarlan who understood human history felt cold dread seep into their consciousness. Ambassador Deho stood slowly, still holding Hannah's hand. He looked at the Crown Mind with an expression of profound sorrow. You will surrender Prince Kasrim to human justice, he said quietly. Immediately. The Crown Mind's 17 voices buzzed in consultation, then spoke as one. The prince is of the royal hive. He has diplomatic immunity under subsection 12 of the treaty articles. We cannot comply with this request. Deho nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. Then, the treaty is void. All human representatives will evacuate this station within the hour. He looked down at Hannah one last time. And, may whatever gods watch over us all have mercy on both our peoples. The peace that had lasted 500 years died with General Hannah in that moment. What came next would remind the galaxy why that peace had been so precious, and why breaking it was the worst mistake the Zarlan Empire would ever make. The news of General Hannah's death reached Earth 6 hours after it happened, traveling through the quantum communication network that linked human colonies across hundreds of light years. Borum was in his office at Mars Command when the alert came through. He watched the footage 3 times, his expression never changing, before he finally stood and walked to the window overlooking the Martian shipyards. The yard stretched for kilometers across the Red Desert, massive construction bays that had built cargo haulers and colony ships for as long as Borum could remember. He was 45 years old. He had never seen them build anything meant to kill. His communicator buzzed. The Human Defense Council was calling him in. Borum was not surprised. His great-great-grandfather had been the last warrior admiral humanity had known, the man who signed the treaty 500 years ago. The old admiral's journals were required reading at the academy, studied as historical curiosities by officers who never expected to use them. Borum had read them differently. He had studied them like textbooks, absorbing every lesson about strategy, logistics, and the psychology of warfare. His instructors had called it a harmless obsession, an academic's fascination with the past. Now, as he boarded the shuttle to Earth, Borum wondered if some part of him had always known this day would come. The Defense Council met in Geneva, deep underground in bunkers built during the Old War and maintained ever since. Borum had never been in these rooms before. They smelled old, the air recycled through systems that had run continuously for centuries. Around the table sat representatives from every human world, their faces grim. Admiral Borum, the council chair said, using his new rank though he had not yet officially accepted it. The Zarlan Empire has refused to surrender Prince Kasrim. They claim diplomatic immunity. Ambassador Deho has withdrawn all our delegations. The treaty is void. She paused, her hands flat on the table. The vote was unanimous. We are at war. Borum nodded slowly. What are my orders? Prepare the fleets. Show the galaxy that we remember how to fight. And, make the Zarlans regret what they have done. Over the next 72 hours, humanity transformed. The shipyards on Mars, Europa, Titan, and a dozen other moons roared to life with a sound they had not made in 500 years. Construction bays that had built peaceful vessels now followed different blueprints, plans that had been stored in sealed databases for centuries and updated quietly by people who hoped they would never be needed. Lieutenant Minji stood on the bridge of her corvette, the CSS Retribution, and tried to process what was happening. She was 28 years old. She had joined the fleet because space fascinated her, because she wanted to see distant stars and ferry supplies between colonies. Her training had included combat simulations, but those were games, scenarios that existed only in computers. Now her crew of 35 was being deployed to the border regions. Real ammunition was being loaded into weapons systems that had only ever fired simulation rounds. Her engineering team was installing armor plating and shield generators that turned her swift little cargo escort into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Captain, her first officer said, using her new rank. She had been promoted that morning, along with hundreds of other junior officers as the fleet rapidly expanded. The crew wants to know, have any of us actually fought before? Minji looked at him. He was 31, a veteran of 12 years of peaceful service. No, she said honestly. None of us have. But, our ancestors did. The Zarlans are about to learn that we still can. Across human space, similar scenes played out. Reservists were called up, their civilian lives put on hold as they returned to service. Factories that made civilian goods retooled their production lines. Asteroid mines shifted from extracting materials for construction to extracting materials for war. The transformation was so smooth, so efficient, that it frightened the other species who watched. Humanity had not just maintained the capacity for war during their long peace. They had planned for it, prepared for it, and built their entire infrastructure to support it if necessary. They had just chosen not to use it. In the Zarlan Empire, observer Thelrex watched the human mobilization with growing dread. He was an intelligence analyst, one of the few Zarlans who specialized in understanding other species. His job was to predict what potential enemies might do. And what he was seeing in the human response terrified him. He compiled a report for the Crown Mind, detailing what he had learned from the historical archives. Humans were persistence hunters, evolved on a death world where they survived by being tougher than everything that tried to kill them. They formed bonds across genetic lines, cooperating in ways that hive species like the Zarlans could barely understand. And, when pushed to violence, they did not fight for territory or resources alone. They fought for ideas, for principles, for emotions like revenge and justice that made them willing to die for causes greater than themselves. They will not stop, Thelrex wrote in his report. If we fight them, they will fight until we surrender or they are extinct. There is no middle ground in the human psychology of war. They are capable of deciding that mutual destruction is preferable to defeat. The Crown Mind read the report and dismissed it. Thelrex was overcautious, seeing threats where none existed. Yes, humans had been dangerous once, but that was 5 centuries ago. The Zarlan Empire had spent that time advancing, improving their technology, expanding their fleets. They had 6,000 warships ready for deployment. According to their intelligence, humans had perhaps 800 vessels that could charitably be called combat-capable. The numbers favored the Zarlans. The technology favored the Zarlans. The strategic position favored the Zarlans. Crown Mind Velshera was certain that this would be a short war, one that would remind the humans of their place in the galactic order. Admiral Boram's first fleet assembled at the edge of human space. It was not the massive armada the Zarlans expected. Only 200 ships, a mix of retrofitted civilian vessels and the few actual warships humanity had maintained. They looked outmatched, outgunned, and utterly inadequate for the task ahead. But Boram had read his great-great-grandfather's journals carefully. Wars are not won by having the most ships, the old admiral had written. They are won by being willing to use the ships you have in ways your enemy does not expect. The fleet's target was Casvel Prime, the home world of Prince Casrim. The planet was deep in Zarlan territory, protected by defense stations and patrol fleets. Taking it would be impossible by conventional military thinking. Boram gave the order to jump. The human fleet disappeared into hyperspace, moving toward their target with a speed and precision that surprised the Zarlan observers who tracked them. Human hyperspace technology had improved significantly during the peace. The Zarlans had assumed it was for better trade routes. They had assumed wrong. On her corvette, Minji watched the countdown to their emergence from hyperspace. Her hands were shaking slightly. Her crew was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts about what was coming. They were going to war. They were going to fight. And some of them were going to die. But, as Minji looked at the faces of her crew, she saw something else too. Determination. Resolve. A willingness to do what was necessary because General Hannah had been murdered and justice demanded a response. The Zarlans had forgotten what humans were capable of when they decided something was worth fighting for. They were about to remember. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Casvel system. Alarms immediately began blaring on Zarlan defense stations as they detected the human ships. But, by then, Boram's plan was already in motion. Special operations teams had already infiltrated the planet's surface, moving through the gaps in Zarlan security. Sabotage charges were being placed on critical infrastructure. Communication networks were being mapped and prepared for disruption. And, most importantly, the precise location of Prince Casrim was being confirmed. Boram stood on the bridge of his flagship and opened a channel to the Zarlan defenders. "This is Admiral Boram of the Human Defense Fleet. We have come for Prince Casrim. Surrender him to us, and we will leave peacefully. Refuse, and we will take him by force. You have 1 hour to decide." The Zarlan response was swift and predictable. Their defense fleet moved to engage, nearly 400 ships against Boram's 200. The odds looked terrible for the humans. But, the Zarlans were learning their first lesson about fighting humanity. When humans went to war, they did not fight fair. They fought to win. The battle for Casvel Prime lasted 17 hours, but the outcome was decided in the first 30 minutes. The Zarlan defense fleet moved to engage Admiral Boram's ships in what they expected to be a conventional space battle. They had more ships, better weapons, and the advantage of fighting near their own supply bases. By every tactical calculation, they should have won. They did not understand that humans had spent 500 years studying every war they had ever fought, learning from every mistake, and developing new strategies that no enemy had ever seen. While the Zarlans had maintained their military traditions unchanged, humans had evolved the art of war into something terrible and new. Borum's fleet did not engage directly. Instead, they scattered across the system in a pattern that made no sense to Zarlan tactical computers. Some ships accelerated toward the planet. Others moved toward the system's outer asteroid belt. A dozen corvettes, including Lieutenant Minji's CSS Retribution, dove toward the star itself, using its gravity well to build speed. The Zarlan commanders divided their forces to pursue, which was exactly what Borum wanted. Human ships were individually weaker, but they were faster and more maneuverable. And humans had learned something important during their centuries of peace: coordination between independent units was their greatest strength. While the space battle developed, Commander Sun Wu and his special operations team were already on the planet's surface. Sun Wu was 33, trained in combat techniques recovered from ancient Earth archives. He had 50 soldiers with him, facing a planet of 3 billion Zarlans and security forces numbering in the millions. The odds did not concern him. Humans had never let odds determine what they were willing to attempt. Sun Wu's team moved through the undercity beneath the capital, using mapping data gathered over years of peaceful trade. The Zarlans built their cities in layers, with the poor and working classes living in the dark lower levels while the elite occupied the surface towers. It made their society stable but their cities vulnerable to anyone who understood vertical warfare. Prince Kasrim was being held in his family's fortress, a massive structure in the heart of the capital. The building was guarded by the Royal Hive Guard, elite warriors who had trained for centuries in the traditional Zarlan way of fighting. They expected enemies to come from the front, to announce themselves, to fight with honor. Sun Wu came from below. His team cut through the fortress foundations with plasma torches, creating entry points in places the Zarlans never imagined needed defending. They moved through the building like water flowing through cracks, avoiding direct confrontation, using stealth and surprise instead of brute force. The Zarlan guards were brave and skilled, but they had been trained for ritualized combat, for duels and honorable battles. They had no doctrine for dealing with enemies who struck from unexpected angles, who used their own building systems against them, who treated war as a problem to solve rather than a test of courage. In space above, the battle was turning into a disaster for the Zarlans. Their ships were being led into ambush after ambush. Human vessels would appear to flee, drawing Zarlan pursuers into positions where they faced crossfire from multiple directions. Minji's corvette squadron, using the star's gravity to build tremendous speed, came roaring through the Zarlan formation like bullets, their weapons firing in perfect coordination. 3 Zarlan cruisers were destroyed in that single pass. Minji's ship took damage, scoring across her hull that her damage control teams rushed to repair, but they survived. And, more importantly, they had demonstrated something crucial: humans were not fighting the war the Zarlans expected. The Zarlan commanders began to realize they were facing something unprecedented. Human ships moved in ways that should not be possible, executing maneuvers that required split-second timing between vessels separated by thousands of kilometers. The level of coordination suggested they were a hive mind like the Zarlans, but intelligence reports confirmed each ship had an independent commander making individual decisions. It should not have worked. Individual commanders should have created confusion, conflicting orders, chaos. Instead, the humans moved like a school of fish, each reacting to the others in perfect harmony despite having no telepathic link. Observer Thelrex, watching the battle from Zarlan High Command, understood what he was seeing. They trained for this, he said aloud, knowing no one would listen. For 500 years, they trained for this exact scenario. Every simulation, every exercise, every war game they played was preparation. They knew this day might come. Below, in the fortress, Sun Wu reached the royal chambers. Prince Kasrim was surrounded by 24 guards, but the guards were looking outward, toward the doors and windows. They never looked up. Sunwoo and his team dropped from the ceiling, having crawled through the ventilation systems, and the fight was over in seconds. Kasrim was secured, sedated, and carried back through the route Sunwoo's team had cut. By the time the Zarlan security forces understood what had happened, the human team was already back in the Undercity, moving toward their extraction point. In orbit, Admiral Borum received the signal. The package was secure. He immediately broadcast to all Zarlan forces, "We have what we came for. Cease fire and withdraw, or we will destroy every ship in this system." The Zarlan commander refused. Rage and humiliation drove him to continue the battle, to try to salvage something from this disaster. It was a fatal mistake. Borum gave the order, and his fleet stopped holding back. Weapons that had seemed weak suddenly revealed their true capabilities. The humans had been fighting at half power, testing Zarlan capabilities, learning their tactics. Now they fought to end it. The Zarlan fleet broke within 2 hours. Of the 400 ships that began the battle, less than 100 escaped. Human losses were 12 ships destroyed and another 30 damaged. By any measure, it was a devastating victory. But Borum did not celebrate. He knew this was just the beginning. He ordered his fleet to withdraw to neutral space, taking Prince Kasrim with them. The trial would be public, broadcast across the galaxy, and it would be conducted exactly according to human law. The trial took place aboard Borum's flagship, in a chamber hastily converted into a courtroom. Judges were selected from the fleet's legal officers. Evidence was presented with careful precision. Prince Kasrim was given every legal protection human law allowed, including defense attorneys who argued his case as vigorously as if they believed in it. The trial lasted 3 days. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Kasrim was guilty of murder, of breaking the treaty, and of violating the most fundamental laws of civilization. The sentence, under human law, was death. The execution was carried out professionally, without ceremony or spectacle. It was broadcast across all galactic channels so there could be no doubt, no claims of deception. Prince Kasrim, who had murdered General Hanna because he thought humans were weak, died knowing he had been completely wrong. Admiral Borum then broadcast his message to the Zarlan Empire and the watching galaxy. His face was calm, his voice measured, but his words were iron. The treaty is void, but peace can be restored. The Zarlan Empire must acknowledge responsibility for General Hanna's murder. You must pay reparations for the damage done. You must cede the 3 disputed border systems to human administration. You have 30 standard days to accept these terms. If you refuse, we will continue this war until you have nothing left to refuse with. In the Zarlan Imperial Palace, Crown Mind Velshera heard these terms and felt rage burn through all 17 linked consciousnesses. How dare these humans make demands? How dare they humiliate the Empire this way? The Crown Mind called for the Grand Fleet to be assembled, for every ship the Empire possessed to converge on human space. 3,000 vessels began moving toward the border. It was the largest military force assembled in 4 centuries of peace. The Zarlans would show these upstart humans what true power looked like. They would crush the human fleets, occupy their worlds, and force them back into submission. Observer Thelrex tried one last time to make the Crown Mind understand. "They want us to attack," he said desperately. "This is a trap. Everything Borum did was designed to make us respond exactly this way. Please, we must negotiate." But the Crown Mind was beyond reason, driven by hive mind consensus that saw the challenge as genetic, not just political. To back down would be to admit weakness, and weakness was death to a species evolved from hive insects. The Grand Fleet jumped toward human space. And, in her small corvette, now stationed at New Sol Colony, Lieutenant Minji received the alert that 3,000 Zarlan ships were coming toward her position. She looked at her crew, these 35 people who had never fought before 3 weeks ago and were now veterans of the Casvel battle. She saw fear in their eyes but also determination. They knew what was coming. They knew the odds. And they knew that humans did not surrender, did not retreat, and did not abandon their people. New Sol had 40,000 civilians. Those civilians were humanity's responsibility to protect. Minji opened the fleet channel to the other corvette captains in the defense force. "This is retribution," she said, her voice steady. "The enemy is coming. We hold the line here. Make every shot count. And, remember what Admiral Borum taught us, we don't have to beat them. We just have to make them wish they never came." The galaxy watched and waited. The real war was about to begin. 6 months into the war, Captain Yuna stood in the Logistics Command Center on Europa and watched numbers flow across dozens of screens. She was 31 years old, and, before the war she had managed supply chains for civilian cargo operations. Now she coordinated the movement of ammunition, fuel, parts, food, and medical supplies across a front that stretched across 20 star systems. The numbers told a story that terrified the Zarlans who saw them. Human industrial production had increased by 300% in half a year. Shipyards that had built 1 vessel per month now produced 3. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Asteroid mines extracted materials at rates that should have been impossible. But, Yuna knew the real secret was not in how much they produced. It was in how efficiently they used what they had. Every bullet fired, every missile launched, every spare part installed was tracked, analyzed, and optimized. Humans fought with mathematics as much as weapons, and the equations were not in the Zarlan's favor. The war had not gone the way anyone expected. The Zarlans had sent their grand fleet expecting decisive battles and quick victory. Instead, they found themselves fighting a war that seemed to have no front lines and no rules they understood. Admiral Borum refused to give them the massive fleet engagement they wanted. His ship struck supply convoys, destroyed communications relays, captured logistics bases, and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. When Zarlan forces concentrated to crush him, he simply went somewhere else. When they spread out to protect their territory, he struck wherever they were weakest. Lieutenant Minji, now commanding a destroyer after her corvette was destroyed at New Sol, learned to fight the Zarlan way and, then, break every rule. Her ship, the CSS Defiance, was part of a squadron that specialized in what the fleet called aggressive reconnaissance. They would jump into Zarlan-controlled systems, gather intelligence, provoke a response, and, then, use the enemy's own reactions to set traps. The Battle of New Sol had become legendary in the human fleet. 200 corvettes against a Zarlan battle group that should have overwhelmed them. The asteroid field around the colony became a killing ground where human ships used their smaller size and better coordination to tear apart the Zarlan formation. Of the 200 Zarlan ships, only 40 escaped. New Sol held, though it cost the lives of 200 human spacers. Minji had been there, had fought there, and had survived by doing things her training said were impossible. Now she taught those lessons to new crews, spreading the tactics that kept humans alive against superior numbers. In the Zarlan Empire, the war was not going well. Crown Mind Velshera had expected to crush human resistance within months. Instead, 6 months had passed and the Empire was losing territory. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. Like water wearing away stone, the human advance was relentless. Observer Thelrex had been promoted to strategic advisor, though his warnings still went mostly unheeded. He produced report after report showing that the war was unwinnable. Human ships were now being produced faster than the Zarlans could destroy them. Human tactics were evolving with every battle while Zarlan doctrine remained frozen in tradition. Most damning of all, human crews were getting better while Zarlan crews grew demoralized. Humans learned from every defeat, studied every battle, and shared information across their entire fleet with a speed that suggested some form of telepathy even though Thelrex knew they had none. They just communicated better, trusted each other more, and adapted faster than any species the Zarlans had ever fought. They fight like they are one organism, Thelrex wrote in his latest report, but they are not. Each human makes individual choices, yet those choices somehow combine into perfect coordination. We fight as a hive mind and should have the advantage of unified purpose. Instead, their distributed intelligence defeats our centralized control every time. The Crown Mind read the report and decided on a desperate measure. If conventional warfare would not work, then they would escalate. Deep in the Imperial vaults were weapons banned by the old treaty. Void Eaters, ancient devices that could destroy entire planets by collapsing their cores. Deploying them would be seen as genocide by the galaxy, but the Crown Mind was beyond caring what others thought. The target was Sabiol, a human colony world with 800 million people. It was chosen specifically because it had no military value, because destroying it would serve no tactical purpose. The Zarlans wanted to break human morale, to show that continuing the war would cost them everything they had built during the peace. The Void Eater was deployed in secret, placed in Sabiol's orbital space by a stealth ship. When it activated, there was no warning, no chance to evacuate. The planet's core destabilized in seconds. Within an hour, Sabiol was a cloud of debris where 800 million humans had lived. The news reached the human fleet 6 hours later. In her logistics center, Eunice stopped working and just stared at the screen showing the casualty estimates. 800 million. The number was so large it became meaningless, impossible to grasp. She had friends on Sabiol. She had family there. Now they were all gone. Admiral Borum received the news while meeting with his senior commanders. He listened to the report in silence, his face showing nothing. When it was finished, he dismissed everyone except his operations officer. Then, and only then, did he allow himself to show emotion. His hand shook as he poured himself water, and his voice was tight with controlled rage. "Send a message to Earth," he said. "Request authorization for unrestricted operations. The gloves come off." The authorization came back within 2 hours. The Human Defense Council's response was brief: protect our people. By any means necessary. Borum had been fighting a limited war, trying to minimize casualties on both sides, hoping the Zarlans would see reason before too many died. Sabiol changed that. If the Zarlans wanted total war, humanity would show them what their ancestors had been capable of when pushed beyond mercy. Commander Minji received new orders that made her sick to read. Her squadron was assigned to Operation Righteous Fury, a systematic campaign against Zarlan economic infrastructure. Not military targets. Not fleet bases. But the factories, refineries, and resource extraction facilities that kept the Empire functioning. The orders were clear: destroy the Empire's ability to wage war. Make them unable to build ships, unable to feed their populations, unable to continue fighting. It was economic warfare taken to its logical conclusion, and it was brutal. Minji executed her orders because 800 million humans were dead and someone had to make the Zarlans pay for it. Her ship struck mining operations on airless moons, destroyed orbital refineries, and disabled the transportation networks that moved goods between worlds. They avoided targeting civilians directly, but the effects would be the same. The Zarlan economy was being systematically dismantled. Other human squadrons did the same across dozens of systems. The war that had been fought with some restraint became total. Human forces stopped accepting Zarlan surrenders except under complete disarmament. Captured territory was not occupied but stripped of anything useful and abandoned. The message was clear: every day the war continued, the Zarlans lost something they would never get back. Captain Yuna coordinated the logistics of destruction with the same efficiency she had once used for construction. She scheduled the flow of weapons and fuel to maintain constant pressure. She optimized shipping routes to keep human forces supplied while denying those same routes to the enemy. And she did it all while knowing that her sister had died on Sabiol, that 800 million deaths demanded this response even if it made her hate what she had become. In the Zarlan Empire, the effects were catastrophic. Food shipments failed to arrive. Power grids shut down. Factories went dark. The civilian population, which had supported the war when it seemed to be going well, began to question whether it was worth the cost. Observer Thelrex watched the empire crumble and felt a strange mixture of vindication and despair. He had been right about the humans, but being right gave him no satisfaction. The Crown Mind had made a catastrophic error deploying the Void Eater. Instead of breaking human morale, it had unleashed something terrible. They are not fighting for territory anymore, he told the Crown Mind during one of his increasingly desperate briefings. They are fighting to ensure we never threaten them again. They will reduce us to a pre-industrial state if we do not surrender. And, based on their current operational tempo, they will achieve that objective within 18 months. The Crown Mind's 17 voices buzzed with confusion and fear. This was not how wars were supposed to work. There should be battles, victories, defeats, and, then, negotiated peace. But, the humans were not following those rules. They fought like their ancient ancestors had fought when they conquered their homeworld, with patience, determination, and absolute refusal to stop until the enemy could fight no more. Across the galaxy, other species watched in horror and fascination. Many had dismissed humans as soft, grown weak during their long peace. Now they saw the truth. Humans had not grown weak. They had grown civilized. But, civilization was a choice they made, not a limitation they accepted. And, when pushed past the breaking point, they remembered exactly what they had been before they chose peace. Admiral Borum stood on his flagship's bridge and looked at the tactical display showing Zarlan territory. Red markers showed human advances, blue markers showed Zarlan positions, and gray markers showed systems that had been rendered economically worthless by his campaign. The gray markers outnumbered the blue now. Soon, he knew, they would reach the Zarlan core worlds. The throne world itself would be within range of human weapons. And, then, the Zarlans would face a choice, surrender and accept harsh terms, or fight to extinction. Borum hoped they would choose surrender. But, he was prepared for either outcome. That was what General Hannah had taught him, in her journals and speeches that he had studied so carefully. Hope for peace, but prepare for war. And, if war comes, fight it with every resource you have until the enemy has no choice but to accept your terms. The long march toward the Zarlan throne world continued, one destroyed system at a time. 18 months after General Hannah's assassination, Admiral Borum's fleet assembled at the edge of the Zarhome system. 5,000 human ships hung in the darkness, representing every combat vessel humanity could field. It was an armada larger than any humans had gathered in 500 years, and it had come to end the war. The Zarlan throne world lay before them, a beautiful planet of purple oceans and silver cities that had stood unconquered for 3,000 years. Around it orbited the last substantial Zarlan fleet, barely 800 ships that represented all that remained of the Empire's military power. Behind those ships, 10 billion Zarlans waited to learn their fate. Borum stood on his flagship's bridge and felt the weight of what was about to happen. He was 47 now, though he looked older. The war had aged everyone who fought it. He had become very good at something he wished he had never needed to learn. His tactical officer reported that all ships were in position. His weapons officer confirmed that firing solutions were locked. One word from Borum and the Zarlan throne world would burn. The fleet had the firepower to turn the planet's surface into glass within hours. But Borum had not come here to commit genocide. He had come here to end a war. Open a channel to the Zarlan command, he ordered. All frequencies. Make sure everyone can hear this. The communication system connected, and Borum's face appeared on screens across the Zarlan throne world and throughout what remained of their empire. He looked tired but determined, a man who had done terrible things because they were necessary but took no joy in them. "I am Admiral Borum of the Human Defense Fleet," he said, his voice carrying to billions. 18 months ago, your crown mind refused to surrender the murderer of General Hanna. That refusal cost you your empire. Your fleets are destroyed. Your economy is broken. Your colonies are lost. You have nothing left to fight with. He paused, letting that reality settle. But we did not come here to destroy you. We came here for justice, and we have achieved it. We came here to ensure you could never threaten us again, and we have achieved that too. Now we offer you peace, but it will be peace on our terms. In the Imperial Palace, Crown Mind Velshera listened with all 17 linked consciousnesses screaming in different directions. Some wanted to fight to the last ship, to die with honor rather than surrender. Others wanted survival at any cost. The internal conflict was tearing the hive mind apart. Observer Thelrex stood before the Crown Mind, no longer an ignored advisor but the voice of desperate reason. "We have lost," he said simply. "Everything I predicted has come to pass. If we fight, they will kill us all. If we surrender, at least our people survive. Please. End this." The Crown Mind's voices finally aligned into consensus. Survival was the most fundamental hive imperative. Honor meant nothing to the dead. The broadcast came through in the Crown Mind's harmonized voice, now diminished and broken. "We surrender. State your terms." The negotiations took place aboard Horizon's Gate Station, which had been rebuilt after being destroyed early in the war. Ambassador Deho represented humanity, the soft-spoken diplomat who had held General Hanna as she died. Across from him sat Observer Thelrex, now speaking for a fractured Zarlan government. The terms were harsh but not impossible. The Zarlans would acknowledge full responsibility for starting the war. They would pay reparations over 50 years, amounts calculated to restore what had been destroyed without making it impossible for the Zarlans to rebuild. 12 star systems would be ceded to human control, creating a buffer zone between the two powers. And, most importantly, human observers would be permanently stationed within Zarlan military command to ensure compliance. Deho read each term with quiet precision, his voice never rising, never gloating. He had lost friends in this war. He had watched his entire diplomatic career's work destroyed in seconds when Kasrim shot Hanna. But he took no pleasure in victory, only relief that the killing would finally stop. Thelrex signed the treaty on behalf of the Zarlan Empire. His manipulating arms shook as he marked the document. He had tried to prevent this war, had warned repeatedly about the dangers of underestimating humanity. Now he would spend the rest of his life helping his people recover from the disaster they had brought upon themselves. When the signing was complete, Deho stood and offered his hand in the human gesture of agreement. Thelrex looked at it, then carefully extended one of his own arms to clasp it. The image was broadcast across the galaxy, a human and a Zarlan, once enemies, now bound by treaty once again. But, away from the cameras and ceremonies, the true cost of the war was being counted. Commander Minji, now Captain Minji of the destroyer CSS Defiance, attended a memorial service for her academy class. Of the 200 officers who had graduated together, only 97 remained alive. The others had died in battles across a dozen systems, giving their lives to protect human worlds and push back the Zarlan advance. Minji stood at attention as the names were read, each one a friend, a colleague, someone she had trained with and laughed with and would never see again. When the ceremony ended, she remained standing long after the others had left, staring at the memorial wall where those names would be inscribed forever. Captain Yuna had transitioned from military logistics to reconstruction coordination. Her genius for managing resources was now being applied to rebuilding Sabiol. The destroyed planet could not be restored, but a massive memorial was being constructed in the debris field, a monument that would list all 800 million names. Yuna worked on the project with fierce dedication, barely sleeping, pushing herself until her staff worried about her health. Her sister's name would be on that wall, and Yuna was determined to make it perfect, to create something worthy of the people who had died there. Admiral Borum did not attend the victory celebrations on Earth. Instead, he submitted his resignation the day after the treaty was signed. The Human Defense Council tried to convince him to stay, to help rebuild the fleet and train the next generation. He refused. "I became very good at killing," he told the council chair during their final meeting. "I studied war my entire life, and, when the time came, I used that knowledge to destroy an empire. But, I never wanted to be good at this. I wanted to be a scholar, a teacher, someone who studied history rather than made it." He returned to Mars, to a small house overlooking the shipyards that had built the fleet he commanded. He refused all interviews, declined all honors, and spent his days writing a comprehensive history of the war. Future generations would read his account and understand exactly what had happened and why it must never happen again. The memorial service for General Hannah was held 3 years after the war ended, on Earth in a garden specially designed to honor her memory. It was not a monument to military glory but a quiet place of reflection, with trees and flowers and a simple marble wall bearing her final words, "Remember what we were, before the peace." Thousands attended, including representatives from the Zarlan Empire. Thelrex was there, along with younger Zarlans who were studying at human universities as part of the cultural exchange program mandated by the treaty. They walked through the garden quietly, reading the inscriptions, trying to understand the woman whose death had changed the galaxy. In one corner of the garden, a young human cadet named Jihun was explaining the memorial to a group of Zarlan students. He was 19, born after the war began, and he had grown up in a galaxy where humans and Zarlans were learning to trust each other again. Observer Thelrex, now very old by Zarlan standards, approached the group and listened to Jihun's explanation of General Hannah's life and work. When the young human finished, Thelrex asked the question that haunted him. "Do you think there will be another war between our peoples?" Jihun considered the question carefully, looking at the Zarlan students who were his classmates, then, at the memorial wall. "I hope not," he said finally. "But, if there is, we will be ready. That is what General Hannah taught us. Peace is not the absence of strength. It is the choice not to use it. We remain strong so that we can choose peace." He paused, then added, "But, we also remember what happened when that choice was taken from us. We remember Sabiol. We remember all those who died because someone forgot that humans are dangerous when pushed too far. Maybe that memory will keep the peace better than any treaty." Thelrex nodded slowly, his antennae drooping with age and sadness. "Then, perhaps this peace will last longer than the last one. We paid a terrible price to learn that lesson. I hope we never forget it." Above them, in the sky over Earth, human and Zarlan ships flew in formation on a joint patrol. The crews worked together now, training side by side, learning each other's languages and customs. The enmity was fading, replaced by a cautious respect that might someday become friendship. In the garden, children played among the flowers, human and Zarlan young running together without fear or hatred. They did not remember the war, knew it only from history lessons and the stories their parents told. For them, peace was normal, the way things had always been. But, the memorial stood as a reminder. The marble wall with General Hannah's words. The names of the dead inscribed in stone. The history of what had happened when peace was broken and humans remembered what they were capable of. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson. Humanity's greatest strength was not their capacity for violence, though that was considerable. It was their ability to choose peace even when they could choose war. To build rather than destroy. To forgive rather than hate. But, the galaxy had also learned that this choice was not weakness. It was discipline. And, when that discipline was tested, when humans were pushed beyond the breaking point, they would do what was necessary to protect their people and their principles. They would fight with creativity, determination, and absolute refusal to surrender until their enemies had no choice but to accept peace. The war had cost millions of lives on both sides. It had destroyed economies and shattered the 500-year peace. But, it had also taught both species something vital about each other and themselves. Humans learned that they could still fight when necessary, that the capacity for war had not been bred out of them by centuries of peace. But, they also learned that they did not want to be warriors, that the life of building and creating was better than the life of destroying. Zarlans learned that old traditions and assumptions about other species could be fatally wrong. They learned that respect was earned through understanding, not demanded through arrogance. And they learned that humanity was far more dangerous than their peaceful civilization suggested. As the sun set over the General Hanna Memorial Garden, casting long shadows across the marble walls, the visitors began to leave. The Zarlan students walked with their human classmates, discussing history and philosophy, arguing good-naturedly about interpretations of the war. Observer Thelrex remained behind, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. He was the last of his generation, the last Zarlan alive who had tried to prevent the war and failed. He came to this garden every year, seeking some kind of peace with what had happened. A human woman sat down beside him. She was elderly, white-haired, wearing the simple clothes of a civilian. But, Thelrex recognized her insignia, she was a veteran of the war. "I lost my son at New Seoul," she said quietly. He was a lieutenant on one of the corvettes. 26 years old. "I am sorry," Thelrex said, meaning it. "Are you Observer Thelrex? The one who tried to warn them?" "I am." She nodded. "Thank you for trying. It matters that someone tried to stop it." They sat in silence for a while, two old beings who had lived through the war and carried its scars. Around them, the garden grew dark as the last light faded. But, somewhere in that darkness, the next generation was building something new, something better than what had come before. The peace would hold. Both peoples were determined to make sure of that. Because they remembered what happened when it broke, and neither wanted to pay that price again.